I've heard you do 1 hour talks, 6 hour talks, and on some related topics. But this is a nice pair of things he's melded together. Cindy, our manager at New Start, has heard Stephanie Covington, who is one of Dan's collaborators, present on women in recovery and helping women with trauma. But the topic of men with trauma is really underappreciated, though Dan does a very nice job of helping you appreciate it and is filling the gap for treatment programs all over the country as far as dealing with these issues. We have eating disorder staff here as well as addiction staff and experiential therapy staff who are really good, who work in all areas of the hospital. So I hope you have fun, and I'm going to go do my consults.
All right.
So welcome to Wisconsin.
Great, thanks.
Okay.
Thanks for having me.
Too bad his partner in crime, Rick, wasn't able to make it, but Dan can handle things fine. So
Yeah.
okay.
All right, great.
Have a nice afternoon.
Thanks, Dr. Miller. It's the one thing I need. I may need another one too.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. What?
She says I used the name of the treatment program where I worked 21 years instead of the one where I worked for 3. I didn't catch that, but she did. And it's on tape.
What'd you say?
New Start, where I used to work.
I caught it and I was wondering, what?
Sorry.
I thought you were talking about a breakfast cereal.
It's still a 7-1 ratio.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. How are you doing? So I'd love to make this, because we have a smaller group, I'd love to make this as informational and kind of collaborative, discussion-oriented as possible. I got a lot of slides to get through, but discussion is more important to me than getting through my slides since you have the PowerPoint. But one of the first questions that I have for you is if there was like one thing that you'd really like to get out of this, what would it be? You're going to spend 2 hours of your time with me.
I think for me, and I saw in your handout the rules of being a man, how to work around some of those or jump over some of those. Some of the people I see being an art therapist, I've had one guy tell me that art stuff, that's women's work, and so he refused to the very end of his stay to come. It was on the detox to come to the group, and I'd always encourage him to come. But there are those rules that, not so much the art stuff, but those rules of being a man kind of thing. It's like, let's get through that stuff right now because we have to, and it's important that we do that. And so, but there's always these barriers to getting through that stuff, and I'd like to learn how to just jump over all that nonsense just to get to the heart of the matter, because we only have 30 days.
Yeah. Well, if you leave here and you don't have confidence that you got that out of this training, then I've definitely failed, because that's my expertise. And it's a matter of engagement, meeting men where they're at, but also, we talk so much about this whole idea of the research now showing that the therapeutic alliance is everything, but the therapeutic alliance can only go so far as the degree to which we actually see the person. And for a lot of the time, we actually haven't seen men as they are or treated them that way. It's kind of, it's a little bit, it's easier for me to show that than to just say it, because it's a pretty bold statement, and it doesn't mean to disparage or diminish any of the services that we provide, because the reality is that we haven't put a lot of time or attention into really thinking about what do men need. We just have given men services, and we've kind of built a lot of the services around that just standard model. But with Stephanie Covington and the work that she's done for women, we've now learned from that things that we could be doing differently for men, and that's a big part. Well, that is what I do, is really helping to train, educate clinicians on that distinction of what does it mean to really focus on men's needs in the treatment milieu. Any other things? Anything else you'd like to get out of this, or a question that you're coming with, or a particular challenge that you have with men?
Well, I'm the therapist over there with the men in the residential eating disorder center, and we get a number of guys with trauma, without trauma, we've got the sexual identity issues, we have gay males, we have heterosexual, I mean, adolescents, adult, I mean, so we have quite a mixture of people, and we've actually even been talking about treating the men a little bit different than the women because it's not a cookie cutter approach, and you know, a lot of my guys are very physical and they're climbing up the walls because they just feel like I just can't sit here and talk in a group, and so we're kind of looking at some of that, but just, I guess the trauma piece is not my expertise, so maybe just some fundamental things about how to approach somebody with trauma as a male, and you know, something that won't do more harm than good. Yeah. And just what your perspectives are on that.
Sure. So what I'll do, you know, as Mike was saying, this is I mean, I often will do a 2 or 3 day training, so this is really just meant to be an overview. And so the challenge for me is I get so excited about it, and so it's hard for me to just kind of do it a little bit. But I really do want to have conversation with you as you react to the information. So, so let's just start. I mean, I can tell you a little bit about my background. I've worked in the field for 18 years. I started in a state psychiatric hospital, and it was just crazy. It was crazy. I was early in recovery myself, and the level of trauma, looking back, was so significant, and it was just as significant for the people working there as it was for the kids who were there. And that's probably been a huge disconnect in this field that we'll be talking about as well. But from there, I've worn a number of hats that I think has given me a kind of particular advantage in some ways of seeing these things. I've worked in policy, I've worked in research, I've worked in public advocacy, I've worked in prevention, I did direct services, I was trained at Hazelden, I did my master's research on the social construction of masculinity and the culture of Alcoholics Anonymous. I have kind of eaten, slept, and breathed this idea, this concept, almost since walking into my personal first meeting, because I was already exposed to the ideas of gender through sociology at my university. So the first thing I'll do is I'll show you a little clip, which, can we turn just these lights off? Is there just like a, I don't want to turn off all of them. Like, can you just turn off a row or no? Okay. So there's a lot of great videos out there, but this next video kind of can help to show a little bit about why something like this might be really valuable. Or not. So, you know, you're talking about trauma and you're talking about kind of dealing with men and trauma, and I don't know the extent to which you've had any training on trauma, but it really has been this kind of revolutionary idea in some ways. In some ways, it's kind of going back to things that used to be done before I worked in the field, but with a new sense of purpose, and also with new information, particularly a new understanding of the brain. So one of the things I just like to do really quick, and I don't know if you all notice this, and this is I really don't mean this to be disrespectful, but I take a lot of time to practice meditation and calming and that sort of thing. And so I don't know how much you all feel it, but in some of your buildings, there is a very high level of anxiety. There is a very, and it's really interesting because you have this very calm environment, and then you run into the staff, and it's like, boom. And of course, when you work in acute services, you have that, but that's something to pay attention to, because we as human beings are very sensitive to that. I'm not coming from that space, and so I'm very tuned in to what's going on with other people individually. And it's been very interesting, because a part of me just wanted to say, it's okay. Just take a deep breath. It's all good. It's all right. Particularly as my own kind of anxiety addiction that I've had. So the advanced breathing, what potentially could feel like a fairly simplistic tool, can be utterly profound. So what I'd like you to do is just sit up, put your feet on the ground, and I'd just like you to do a really quick breathing exercise with me. And the main thing is that breathing diaphragmatically, so breathing, right? So your stomach comes out, but breathing through your nose for the count of 4, hold it for the count of 4, breathing out for the count of 4, and pausing for the count of 4. And we'll just do that twice, okay? So in case any of us are carrying any anxiety, it might help to mitigate that. So breathe in, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, breathe out, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, and then just do that one more time. So that's maybe like a 30-second exercise, and I don't know if any of you feel just any more relaxed, any calm, but even with the
I wanted to do more when that phone went off.
yeah,
Yeah.
even with the phone ringing, yeah, you can just detach from those things. I mean, you can just not notice them, but really the breathing thing is really important for men. Because what that man was telling you is extremely important. The man who wouldn't engage in the art. It's extremely important. He's saying, and I'll get into this with this exercise, which can say much more than I ever could. But the question is, if we meet people where they're at, and we want men to feel as though they are not surrendering who they are, then it's not up to them to do the services the way we've got them. It's up to us to do the services so that they can respond effectively to them. And so something like advanced breathing helps men learn how to take care of themselves without having to feel at all self-conscious, because nobody has to know you're even doing it. And when they begin to experience that, when they get to experience the calming, when they begin to experience the body congruence, when they begin to experience just the calming of the central nervous system, all of that, they begin to realize that this is a great tool. But when you point out to them, you can be doing this with your buddies, and nobody has to know you're doing it, that means something. That means something to men. Does it mean something to all men? Do some men resonate with the art therapy? Of course. Of course, So part of this is going to be speaking in generalities, right? I mean, if we're going to talk about men and women, there has to be some degree to which we're talking about this kind of monolithic sort of identity. So I'm not at all confused by the fact that that is only a starting point. and by no means should represent how we see individuals, if that makes sense. So really it's about how do we meet them. But so you talked about the rules for being a man. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because it can be a fairly extensive exercise, but it's something that you can do. I mean, it really doesn't take much to do this, and it's just been amazing to me how profound this exercise can be. And the way you do it is you can use 2 pieces of paper, you can use 1 piece of paper, but the first thing that you do is you start by just saying, look, all of us here, so I'll pretend like you guys are a men's group, all of us here grew up from the moment we were born with these rules for being a man. And we've responded and reacted to those rules in many ways. Some of us live by them as a code, and some of us have rejected them. Some of us fall somewhere in the middle. But nonetheless, there are some pretty strong rules that exist out there. So just as we're thinking about it, what are some of the rules that come to mind for you when you think of how do men prove to each other and to themselves that they're men? What do they do?
Being a provider.
Provider. Okay, what else?
Clean garage.
Clean the garage. What else?
No emotion.
No emotion. Don't show emotion. Okay, what else?
Not crying.
Don't cry.
Fix the house.
Fix things. Right? So not just the house, right? Fix things. So, what else? Protector. Okay, what else?
No pain.
What's that?
No pain.
No pain.
No fear.
No fear. And of course, connected to both of these rules, in fact, connected to several of these rules, if you want to kind of layer down, then there's other rules connected to that. For instance, what are some of the other rules connected to no fear? What would happen if you knew I was afraid? What would you think of me? Weak, right? So don't be weak. And the other thing about the rules is that, you know, there's always the converse. So there's the rule of be strong, and then there's the rule of don't be weak. So the thing that we have to think about is, for men, which is the stronger rule? That we have to be strong, or that you never see me as weak? And so that's another thing to keep in mind. What are some of the other rules? What are some of the rules when it comes to relationships for men? Compartmentalize. And say that differently.
Well, kind of like a waffle. You're in this part, then you can take yourself and put it yourself in this part. You can be detached from one.
So it's easy to see things as unique, isolated experiences rather than seeing the relationship as its own kind of entity.
Right.
Is that
Yeah.
accurate? Okay.
This is what you're doing right now. And
Yeah.
not exist.
Right. So which, you know, to take that further, which means that how some men can do one thing and not understand how that could impact somebody, could have such a strong reaction to it, because for them it's not an isolated incident. It's not one thing. It's something that is connected to other behaviors. Of course, some of that is not just being a man, it's just being oblivious. So what are some of the other rules?
I was going to say guarded, but that kind of fits into emotional.
Well, yeah, but guarded is, I think guarded is a nice way of saying it, because it's not just about emotion. Guarded is that I don't let too much out, period. Right? So, what are some other rules? There's some pretty big rules that we haven't said yet, but what are some rules when it comes for men when it comes to sex?
Must perform.
Performance. Performance is key. Okay, what else? Pursuer, right? And who are we pursuing? It's not a trick question. Who are we pursuing?
Women?
Women. Which means what? Because there's a rule in there. If we're pursuing women, who aren't we pursuing? Which means what? What's the rule? Heterosexual, right? So we're the pursuer. We pursue women. How many women?
A lot, and they have to be hot.
Exactly. Exactly. A lot and hot. Right? A lot and hot. And how often are we having sex?
All the time.
As much as possible, right? I mean, I like to say 24/7. If they get a pill, you know, there'd be a lot of guys taking it if we somehow came up with a pill where guys could have sex for 24 hours. I don't know who they'd find that would be willing to do that. So performance, the pursuer, women, right? So if it's the rule is not that men are heterosexual, right? It goes back to what I was saying earlier. What's the rule? What's the opposite? What's the opposite of heterosexual? Not opposite. I shouldn't say opposite, but homosexual, right? So don't be a homosexual. Is that the rule more than be straight? Do we walk around checking to see if guys are straight, or do we walk around paying attention for any kind of homosexual affectation? Right? So it's don't be gay. Any other rules that you could think of? Things connected to showing no fear or no pain. If I don't have any pain, right? If I have no emotion, that probably means I have no problems. Right? And if I have no problems, what don't I need? Help. Right? So I don't ask for help. And if I don't ask for help, then that enables me to continue projecting this idea that I'm somebody who has what? Power is huge, right? And that I've got all the answers, right? That I know everything. Right. Don't ask for help, don't ask for directions. So, now what's important about this is a great conversation to have with the men because they immediately start to feel comfortable. We're starting to see them, right? This is their experience. And some of them are going to fall on it they're going to fall on it in different ways, but it's still their experience. There's no man growing up who didn't grow up with these rules, whether it's just the fact that he chose not to be this. He still is judged by it a lot of the time. And certainly a lot of men who don't take on a lot of this stuff, they still judge themselves against this. Right? So we have this conversation with men. Now, one of the things that's important to point out, and I usually take a lot of time with this presentation simply because it's so core and foundational to everything we do. All our theory and our philosophical and clinical ideas come out of this dichotomy. But when you see don't show emotion, if you get rid of the don't, and you get rid of the don't show pain, and don't show fear, and don't ask for help, and don't be vulnerable, if you get rid of the don'ts for those, and you have people who are weaker, emotional, cry, fear, ask for help, and are vulnerable, who do we tend to associate that with? Women, right? So it's also implicit and explicit, don't be a girl. Don't be a woman. So from the moment that we're born, those qualities, those attributes are devalued, which puts us in this inherent tension, this constant tension between not only how we value and respect women, but how we value and respect those parts of ourselves. So that's a huge piece. But the other thing is that when you look at a lot of these rules, a lot of them are negative, which means that most of men's identity is built around who we are not to be, rather than who we are to be. We don't live necessarily in an affirmative identity. So we've got this going on, and then let's just take, for instance, Dan, right? This guy named Dan, he got this going on. He comes into treatment. He's brought into treatment, sits down, and he's told some things that he's expected to do that after 30 days, even 2 weeks, we're going to be making some judgments, some clinical judgments about how well Dan is engaging in treatment. What's he doing, right? What are the behaviors and the things you're looking for me to be doing that are going to tell you that I'm serious about my treatment and my engagement in recovery?
Showing emotions.
Okay? Show feelings. What else? What kind of thoughts?
Negative thoughts.
So negative thoughts, what else? I mean, negative thoughts like the Packers suck.
About self, negative self-talk.
So negative self-talk, okay. So negative self-talk, and what I would say, express thoughts, or what I would say is begin to communicate their inner life. Right? The stuff that you can't just look at a man and know for sure that that's what's going on with them. What are some of the other things that are good? Okay, let down your guard. Be less guarded, let down your guard. But what does that mean? What am I doing that's going to let you know that I'm actually doing that?
Being open and honest, so in other words, vulnerable.
Be vulnerable, okay. And what am I being vulnerable about? Or open about? Or honest about?
Hurtful life events.
What's that?
Hurtful life events.
Okay, hurtful life events. So I'm going to talk about pain. What else?
I would say feelings in general.
Feelings in general. What's another thing that I'm doing? If I'm talking about pain, if I'm sharing my inner life and my negative thoughts, if I'm being vulnerable, chances are that there's something else that I'm doing that is, how am I going to let you know? How am I going to let you know that I've got these things going on? Just sharing them?
That's crying.
Okay. So there may be some crying, there may be some other kind of real external affect. What else?
You might develop like closer relationships with other men.
Intimacy with other men. So we really don't have to continue this. We didn't have to continue it after the first two, right? Because what's happening? What's happening with these two lists? They're opposite. They're practically opposite from one another. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is that we've got this system that we have men come into that we are basically telling them, we want you not to be men. And we're not going to come right out and say it. So when a man is saying, I'm not going to do that, that's for women, what he's saying is, I feel like not only is my masculinity threatened, but I don't know who I am without that piece. You know, we are literally asking men to turn their back on the identity they've worked so hard to create, to prove to the world that they're men. And that's not just some, you know, that's not just some little, that's not just some little exercise. For a lot of men, this is really about being able to be safe in the world. So not only are we asking them to turn their back on their identity, but we're asking them to not be safe. But we don't acknowledge this. That's the toughest part about all this, is that we don't acknowledge it. We don't acknowledge this dichotomy. We don't acknowledge this inherent conflict. We don't acknowledge that this would be tough. And so what happens at 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks when we're getting ready to discharge Dan or figure out what's going on, and we say things like, well, you know, I mean, he doesn't really talk in group, or he hasn't really been sharing his feelings, or he thinks all of this stuff is, you know, not something that he wants to do, or he doesn't ask for help, or, you know, whatever it is that we have to say, we're judging him against a model that has not been built around who he is. So we're basically saying, you know what? Dan hasn't completely surrendered being a man and all these rules that he's been following. And so by our estimation of that, that means he's not invested. As opposed to trying to better understand what's getting in the way for Dan, what are the rules that he's hanging on to, and let's have a conversation about that. Instead of making it about Dan, let's make it about this incredibly challenging process of what this means. And so that really becomes the foundation of everything we talk about, that this dichotomy and beginning to address this dichotomy and constantly referring back to this dichotomy is the essential part of how to more effectively engage men in services. And if you think about it, the part about it is that this enables us to tell men that we understand, like we really understand that this is difficult for you. And that you might not even be able to say how difficult this is for you because that's one of the rules. And the fact that you're not asking for help means you're doing exactly what you were taught to do. And so I'm not going to stand back arrogantly and say just because you're not asking for help means you're not ready for treatment, or even worse, because you're not asking for help, then I take that as the sign that I need to break you down. And there's still the vestiges of that philosophy, that mentality toward working with men that says, you know, he's a hard ass, so we got to break him down. He's this, he's that. As opposed to, he's just a guy who is so afraid he's living by these rules, but it's all he knows, it's all he has. So how dare you take that away from him without any respect or compassion for what you're doing? We so thoughtlessly push, coerce, force men into this area so often without acknowledging what we're asking them to do. And the reality is that for a lot of men, this feels good. You know, I mean, like, this is a good way to live. But the other thing about it, and sometimes I might not communicate this clearly enough, is that I'm not saying these are bad and these are good. And I'm not even saying that these are just masculine and these are feminine. All I'm simply saying is that, for the most part, men, nobody ever sat me down. I don't know about any of the other the man in this room. But nobody ever sat me down and asked me what I wanted. Right? Nobody gave me this list of rules and said, hey, which of these do you want to follow? And by the way, here's my experience with this whole don't talk about your feelings thing. That's why I've been married 3 times. And this whole thing about no pain, I'm in pain a lot, and it almost killed me because I couldn't talk to anybody about it. And so now, after suffering with intense back pain, I realize I've got a tumor that's too far gone. So there's nobody's ever really given us a choice, but the other thing about it is to just realize how tenacious and how grounded these are. What I mean by that is, you know, a guy could do great in treatment. A guy could do great 6 months of services, first year of recovery. But the reality is, even 5 years into recovery, you know, what's going to happen? This guy's going to get into a relationship. He's going to find himself wanting to connect with this person, wanting to be vulnerable and open. And every time he does it, it scares the hell out of him. And so what's likely to win? The philosophy that says, that's really good for your recovery and healthy. Or the philosophy that he's had for 30 years that says, retreat. Save yourself. Be safe. Don't let them hurt you or make fun of you. And so how do we begin to really address this piece for men is really, for me, how we should be rethinking and thinking about our services for men. And so it's really this whole idea of, literally with the curriculum that we've written, we want the men to rewrite the rules for being a man. We want them to actively choose which rules they want to follow for being a man. And in that, to really take responsibility as well. Because if you didn't ever choose to do this stuff, you don't have to be responsible for it. And you know, that's why we hear this what I think is such a diminishing and disrespectful thing of where we say, well, that's just how men are. We laugh that off when we say, oh, that's just how men are. But the reality is we're first, taking any responsibility off of them, but the other is that it's simply limiting men's experience and how full it can be if we don't do those things, if we don't treat men in that regard. So when you do these trainings, oftentimes people will say, well, when I say, what do you want to get out of it? It's often, how can I get men to open up? And that's one of the questions. So the first piece around of helping men open up is this whole idea of this. Because let's say you've got a man who relapsed, and he's coming in and he's full of shame, and he's not exactly sure what happened or how to talk about him. If you put these rules in front of him and you have him go through this exercise, I promise you, within that session, you'll be able to talk about his relapse in a way that you couldn't have gotten to probably in a lot more time, because all you have to do is talk to him about the rules. And which of these rules started to get in the way from you? Which of these rules were you struggling with? Talk to me about what it was like. And then all of a sudden you find out what you might never have found out otherwise, which is that he got into an argument with his sponsor and he felt betrayed by his sponsor. And he couldn't talk about it, and his sponsor was a huge part of the group that was his home group, and he felt embarrassed and he couldn't go. Well, you could get at that more likely when you start talking about some of these rules, because you say, okay, well, how was that rule getting in the way for you? Okay, well, tell me what was going on. And you can even ask if they're not really kind of offering a whole lot, then you can say, well, so then let's just talk about the different areas of your life. How are these rules showing up for you in your relationships? Then you begin to get more information. How are these rules showing up for you in your sexual behavior? How are these rules showing up for you personally? So this idea of depathologizing it, do you hear how when I'm having that conversation with the man, not once am I implying that there's something wrong with him. Not once am I making it about him. I'm making it about his struggle to be a man and try to rectify, try to find some peace between this life that he's been given, or these directions or guidelines that he's been given, and then how to do also have some sense of who he is as a man. So meet them where they're at. That's the same thing. Avoid closed-ended questions. I just hate closed-ended questions. I think they're, motivational interviewing and the research around motivational interviewing has shown how ineffective closed-ended questions are. Despite that, we tend to still structure our whole assessment process around closed-ended questions. But particularly for men, you're not going to get near the information you could by asking a yes or no question as opposed to a more open-ended question. Small groups, when we talk about small groups, this is something that's very interesting, is we have found this to be like magic. It doesn't matter if you ever adopt the work that we do or use our curriculum. If you want to just transform the work you do with men, do this exercise, and then when you do whatever exercises you're doing with them, in case you're not already doing this, and you may be, break them up into groups of 3. Groups of 3. Put them in groups of 3 and watch how men open up in a way that you have not ever experienced. Why? Well, it's pretty simple. You put them in 2, and it's going to be a little too easy for them to still be buddies, right? You put them in 4s, and that may work, but the 3s, there's something magical about the 3 because it's harder for a man to hide. You don't really necessarily get the buddy thing. But most importantly is that the men feel safer in smaller numbers. And there's going to be this slight competition of, okay, so this one guy has opened up, now can I do it? But it's a lot safer for them to do it in a group of 3 than even a group of 6 or 7. And so again, this is meeting men where they're at by just doing things in these smaller groups. And the interactive lectures, we'll do an example of an interactive lecture. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. The men's integrated treatment, that's literally the treatment model supporting all this work, and it's inspired by the work that Dr. Covington has done, but it's, male psychological development, addiction, and trauma. And, one of the things that's important to take into consideration, and the woman who had to step out, she has some experience with Dr. Covington, and Dr. Covington, Stephanie Covington, has been a leader in women-specific services. But notice that I said women-specific services and not gender-specific or gender-responsive, because the reality is that until just recently when we started talking about men, we never did gender-specific services. We never did gender-responsive services. Is that we did mostly services for women that really spoke to, or are getting better at speaking to, women's unique issues and needs, and then we often just did the same old thing for men. Because of that reason. Because everything started out being for men. It was created by men. Men were was the model client. And so when women started looking very necessarily at this hole they were being forced into, it was this thing of like, this doesn't really fit for us. But what we didn't then do is, okay, well, how well does it fit for men? How well does it really speak to men's unique issues and needs? And so that's something that we're finally starting to do. But being gender responsive, and this is an important thing, this is, for people who really want to do gender-focused work, it's not just about saying, oh, sure, yeah, we have men and women on separate units and we do separate groups. That's not even close to being the depth of what's possible as far as really getting men and women to open up and connect in a safe way, because it's also about the site selection, it's about staff selection. Sometimes a woman is a better person to work with a man than a man. But it's not necessarily going to be based on sex or gender as much as it's going to be based on some other factors. Program development is literally saying, okay, if we were going to get really serious about our services for men, let's look at the very beginning when they come in all the way to the end, and then let's look at how a man experiences those and what we might do differently. And one of the things when I consult with programs is I say, you know what? Let's start by just having you have one or two men do a walkthrough of your services. And that the whole point of talking to him afterwards is to talk about, you prep him a little bit, but then he goes through and you just talk about how was that for your experiences? How was that for you as a man? And begin to kind of see what some of the nuances could be. And then the content and material. So from my perspective, this is really what's been missing in the dominant paradigm of providing services for men. Impact of male socialization on recovery, which is obviously that exercise. The relational needs of men and abuse and trauma. Some people think the relational needs of men is an oxymoron because there's so much bias against men and our sense of relational skills and relational competence. The abuse and trauma experienced and perpetrated is important because focusing on one or the other as opposed to both is going to almost always leave us with an incomplete picture, and it's going to kind of put us on one extreme or the other. The one extreme is we talk about the abuse that men have experienced, and we tend to be over compassionate with them. And so we don't hold them accountable to the degree that they need. And then the opposite end is when we look at the violence and abuse that a lot of men perpetrate, then what we do is we lose the compassion. And we're afraid, a lot of the times we're afraid as a field, and particularly you see this in anger management, domestic violence programs, we're afraid to try to hold those two things together at the same time, because it's very difficult to do. For the theory of addiction, I'm going to go through that pretty quickly. I think the main thing that I want to say is This is the health model that we follow. Dr. Covington came up with this. And the main thing is that all of these are very similar, but when you think of environmental and you think of political, the environmental is probably something that's still used or thought of by the field in general, but political almost never, comes into it. And for us, political is not necessarily, the whole personal is political sort of thing where it's about getting out and voting and engaging in civic responsibility. That there's an element of that, but it's more about understanding structures of power and how a man relates to power. What does it mean when we say power is such a huge part of the rules and we have men come in and we tell them they're powerless, but how much of a conversation do we really have with them about what that means to them? And not what that means to them just about alcohol and other drugs or about the eating disorder, whatever the addiction is, but about them as a person, as a man, to admit that you're powerless. Because what we see all the time is that men will say, yeah, I'm powerless here in this specific area, and then they'll shore up their resources in other areas to try to gain more power in those. Because for them, it's a zero-sum thing a lot of the time. And it's not conscious, it's that so many men define themselves around having power. If I don't have power, I'm less of a man. So relational cultural theory is kind of one of the dominant psychological paradigms that we use. It came about as a reaction to the traditional Western paradigm, which was created by men, all white men, at least putatively heterosexual men, and the whole thing had been kind of implicitly disparaging of relationships, disparaging of connection. And the idea in the dominant Western paradigm for psychology is that in order to be a healthy human being means one has to individuate, that one has to separate themselves from others and be able to stand alone as a whole healthy human being. And for a lot of women, what women said was, gosh, this really doesn't seem to fit for us. This doesn't resonate with us. It's not our experience. So they started looking at relationships and they came up with this idea of relational cultural theory. Well, it turns out it's it's a wonderful paradigm for evolving our understanding of psychological growth and psychological health, because it's founded on connection. It's founded on this idea that all growth occurs in connection, whether it's disconnection or connection. That is the thing. Hey, Liz, can I get another water? So that's a huge piece of thinking about what are men's relational needs. And again, this is something that was created by women for women. They didn't really have men in mind because they really weren't worried about men and then really shouldn't have been. It was for women, and it was kind of addressing women's unmet needs. But what we found is that this can be very effective for men. And Dr. Stephen Bergman happened to be one of the spouses of the women who created relational cultural theory, and he actually looked at it from a man's perspective. And he saw the challenge of a man in relation versus a man who's individuated, and that these rules kind of move us toward this idea of individuation. And so it was really about striking a balance. On the far end of the continuum, if the only thing you have in your life is relationships, and there's no real self in your life, which is probably the extreme toward which women are socialized, what do we call that? Huh? You said it. Yeah, codependence, right? That it's like a woman especially, but it also happens to men, has no sense of personal space. Everything in their life and their reactions are defined by the relationships. There's not like a space around them that says, you will not cross. This is my space and my space alone. Get out of here. right? And then for men, it's the opposite. For men, it's kind of like, I have this space and you will not cross it. And I don't even know how to get out of it. And so I spend a lot of time just kind of hunkered down in here, and then I put on a happy face when I'm out of here, but I'm scared shitless. So the challenge is to really find a balance. Male relational dread, I'll talk about more later. Agents of disconnection, basically these rules move us toward disconnection. If the goal for a man is to be successful, the goal for a man is to have power, well, for the most part, we tend to think of, what we tend to think of as successful and powerful is not about nurturing relationships. It's not about nurturing connection. That doesn't mean that men don't want to do these things. It means that there's this kind of constant tension, this constant conflict of like, I want to connect with other people. I mean, when men begin to wake up through the process of recovery and begin to take these kind of false barriers that have been protecting them from reality out of the way, you know, you just automatically, for the most part, move toward connection. But if you've spent your whole life protecting yourself from connection and not knowing how to do it and don't really have the skills developed, then how the hell are you going to do that? And is it going to be much more likely that there's going to be at least a conflict in developing connection and being able to kind of protect yourself? Or to the even greater degree, it's just simply that men will just retreat even more into protecting themselves in order to keep themselves safe. And so there's this incredible conflict around wanting connection and yet not knowing how to really do it. And then, of course, power dynamics. Any comments or questions at this time? Like I said, I want it to be conversational. Unless you guys have really someplace you have to get to right after 5, I'd like to go a little bit longer simply because we didn't get started until 10 after. You know, that can allow for more discussion. But at this point, any reactions or questions? Like, one of the things I didn't say, and I usually do this as a bit of a caveat to people who come to my presentation, is that I can pretty much guarantee that every presentation I'll do, I'll at least offend one person. Or I'll certainly step on their toes because I'm challenging so much of what we think we know about men. And part of that is challenging how women have played, you know, the part that women or women's services have played in that. And so I just try to be very clear that the first thing I would challenge is that if you're having a strong reaction to anything I'm saying, my first question to you is, well, what's that about for you? Don't make it about me and kind of shut off kind of what I'm talking about, because chances are the strong reaction, as you well know because you've counseled people on this, but that strong reaction, there's an opportunity there. What is it about this? I mean, I've had men literally get aggressive with me in trainings, and the reality is that I could be put off by that, but it's all it is that. All it is they feel threatened, they feel scared, or here's a guy who looks like he's like just out of high school who's challenging the fact that they've been in 20 or 30 years and doing this thing a certain way, and so they feel insecure about that, and so they get aggressive. You know, and I'm certainly not going to challenge them on that, but my point is that this stuff operates in everything we do. And so when we do these trainings, especially the longer trainings, the whole point is to bring that stuff up and allow us to see it as clearly as possible. One of the things I like to say is I've been doing intensive men's work for 15 years. I've been in recovery for 18 years, 19 next month. I have done counseling. I've done couples counseling. So I have been very invested in being a healthy human being. And these rules kick my ass every day. I am very conscious of these rules. I am very conscious of choosing to be somebody who is not bound by these rules, and they kick my ass every day. So we cannot underestimate the power of these because they're invisible to most men. and they're invisible to most women. They're invisible to us in general. A lot of, there's the rules for being a woman. We could do this exact same exercise and we could do it around the rules for being a woman. But the dichotomy is not nearly as strong when we're talking about any kind of therapeutic relationship or the process of recovery.
So do you think, because addiction treatment was originally set up for men, it was mostly men who came into treatment, there really wasn't women. And if you think back to what it was like, maybe even
Thanks.
as early as 20 years ago, most of addiction treatment was very confrontational.
Yep.
And which isn't the evidence-based approaches that we use now. But do you believe that that's the way it was set up at that time, because it was mostly men coming into treatment, and then the approach was always confrontational because it matched the male rules?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because there's been this false belief, like you said, that's now been incontrovertibly disproven, that you have to break men down. But I think where that came out of was the vulnerability. Where it came out of was men kind of not seeing the rules and not thinking, there is nothing sometimes more powerful than confronting a man. That can be the lifesaver for him. But if that's all you do, it's just so ineffective. And so, I think it comes out of the rules, and quite honestly, it comes out of trauma. It comes out of all the trauma that all these people that were working in the field were living in, and the only way that they knew how to oftentimes protect themselves from experiencing the pain of that trauma, especially as men, was to just take on this kind of hyper masculine counselor so that they could show that they're in power, so that they could kind of, when they were confronted with the men exhibiting the rules, they did what any normal man following the rules would do. Because the rules don't tell us to step aside and say, oh, you're angry. It's, don't get in my face, you son of a bitch. I'll show you what's up. You think that you are doing your family any good, you piece of shit? Right? And we literally used to say that. We'd put people in the corner, we'd put dunce caps on their heads, they'd wear diapers, they'd walk around. There's still treatment centers that do this. Walk around saying, I'm a loser, because there's somebody who's so arrogant and they put all their time and attention into their appearance, and so I'm ugly. It's that kind of stupidity that has really compromised. And so, yeah, maybe some men get sober from that, but I guarantee you, they have shut down. And they're not going to touch their real pain so long as that's how we try to connect with them. So I think it's a great point. And the vestiges of that mentality are still very strong in the field. We pride ourselves on the fact that, we're not super confrontational anymore, but the reality is that we still operate with this idea that men are non-compliant and defiant and assholes and obnoxious and arrogant and all these sorts of things, and we react to a lot of that from a more subtle, insidious way, going back to the whole confrontation and how people viewed men, they had to be broken down. I really believe that that's still got a very strong, a really kind of strong unconscious place in the field.
That's what the military does, basically. Break them down so that they obey orders without question, but you can't do therapy that way.
You can. It doesn't prevent people from trying, but
what I'm saying is it's not effective.
It's not effective, but it can feel effective because you break a man down and you get him to comply. And I'd much rather have a guy complying than have to deal with the sophistication of behavior change. But the thing is that, any guy can act his way through treatment. Compliance is the number one form of resistance. And so so we shouldn't feel good just because the men are doing the things we want them to do. We should see that there's congruence in who they are. I'd much rather have a guy telling me, this stuff is for women. I'm not going to do this shit. Because that's authentic. That's where he's at. I would never put him down for that. I was just coming. I'll talk about this with the trauma piece because I think it's a powerful example.
I was just going to comment, the reason why I decided to take this class is I traditionally work with women, get included in helping Steve out once in a while if someone has trauma. But I would realize that I had a shyness around men, but I could never articulate what it was. And I would know that I was feeling something, but now when I look at the rules, I realize I was buying into the rules and saying to myself, I shouldn't make this person break the rules, and yet I know to be in recovery you have to get to the heart. So this is just like, I got from this what I needed, because I never realized as a female, I was buying into these rules in the therapeutic setting and being very like, oh, how should I say this or where should I go? So I feel like just putting these rules out will help myself as much as it will the other individual to
Absolutely. Thank you for saying that. I mean, it's well said. And if you believe in this, you will always have a context for conversation. You will always have a context for understanding their behavior. And it's not just about, I want to make this really, really clear. The rules aren't bad. There's absolutely nothing wrong with the rules. There's something important about not always showing your feelings. There's something important about not crying. There's something important about not asking for help. There's something important about not being vulnerable. But if that's all you got, if that's all you know, and while you're being driven to your knees, you still can't ask for help. If when your wife is telling you, I just want you to open up, and she's getting ready to leave you and you still can't do it, then that's where it's a problem. And so it's about balance, and it's about sophistication, and it is about choice, and it's about what's working for them. And something I can't emphasize enough that speaks to what you were saying is that fundamentally, 100%, we will absolutely never, ever tell a man what kind of man he should be. We will never judge him for being the man that he is. We let the curriculum and the material be the source of reflection. But when we do this exercise, we have the men towards the end say, these are the rules that work for me. These are the rules that don't work for me. And these are the rules that I'm not sure about. And if a man says the rules that don't work for him are not asking for help, not being vulnerable, and not sharing his feelings, I say, that's awesome. Good for you. You hang on to that because that's important to you. What am I going to do in treatment now? What are you talking about? It's okay for him to not ask for help, be vulnerable, share his feelings. Well, again, because that's your agenda. Your agenda says he has to be here and do this because that's what you think is effective treatment. As opposed to getting him, don't get into a pissing contest with a man. He'll go underground. It's a waste of time. And so instead, it's kind of like, okay, good for you. Then let's talk about that. And what about that is working for you? What do you get out of that? And so then you begin to have a conversation, and so they give you the opening for connecting with them, and you don't have to worry about tiptoeing around them. You don't have to worry about how are they going to, receive this. Because for some men, it's going to be like, what rules don't work for me? Basically all of them. I'm ready to let them all go. And then you could have a conversation like saying, okay, well, let's talk about that. The ones that are working for you, are there, let's look at the rules, and could some of them work for you if we reworded them a little bit? And so, like I said, at the end of the curriculum that we've written, they literally rewrite the rules. But that's an important piece is that to meet them where they're at means that we don't judge who they have to be, and we don't predetermine that. Like if a guy wants to leave treatment not sharing his feelings, if he has done the work that has moved him from a place, like I would never say a guy has to share his feelings before leaving treatment. I would be much more broad about how I'm looking at how he's doing. But chances are you're not going to go through our curriculum without beginning to do that, because the rules get kind of turned on their head, and there's a whole new context. There's a whole new sense of safety in the group. It's kind of one of those things like, as soon as you tell somebody they don't have to do something, they're much more open to it. If you're not forcing them to do that and you're giving them a choice, they're much more likely to engage. And that's what we found with men. Men want to be healthy. But we project all of our bullshit onto them, and then we, accuse them of being defiant, non-compliant, not wanting treatment. But I will stand firmly behind the statement that says the majority of the time that we terminate somebody or that we determine somebody to not be engaged in treatment is because we failed them, not because of them. So this leads us to trauma, which is a huge piece of the field, and it's certainly developing. What has me concerned is that now, because this is becoming more popular, I see treatment centers all over the country just pasting on their marketing materials, we do trauma, we have a horse, we do yoga. And so that means that we deal with trauma, which is not at all what that means. And it's scary for me because they're moving into stuff that they're not trained to do or that they don't have a real appreciation for the complexity of. So, but the other thing about talking about trauma is that there really does clearly seem to be a distinct phenomenon for a lot of men of trauma that is different from women, and we'll talk about that. The most important thing around trauma is to think of the person's response. How many of you have had training on trauma, formal training on trauma? Because I don't want to sound like I'm speaking down to you, because it's not my intention. But there's really some important pieces. The individual's response to the event is absolutely critical. The three of us could go through the same event. We could be in the same family, and we could experience almost the same thing, but have a completely different experience. Based on the fact that maybe it's two women and one man, and growing up, I was the lightning rod for my father's stress and trauma and abuse because I was the boy. And because there's an implicit rule that it's okay to discipline and beat boys much more than it is to do to girls. And so as a result of that, that's the experience. Or for a young girl. And maybe it's just because she was the youngest and she was daddy's little girl that she was the one who was sexually abused. And so the older sister and the older brother have no idea that dad could have done something like that. What are you talking about? Dad was great. And so it's like people grew up in different families. So it's not just what they experienced that could be different, but it could also be the response and the environment's response. But then it's the behaviors and beliefs that develop accordingly. I'm going to come back to this graphic, so I'm not going to talk a whole lot about it right now, other than to say that this really is a great schematic for showing how trauma develops. You have the event, you have the response to the trauma, you have the sensitized nervous system changes in the brain, you have the current stress, and then you have the way that we express the symptoms of the trauma. I can follow up with Liz and send her the PDF of this, but when I train people, I say, look, every person you work with should get a copy of this. You should always have this with you when you're staffing somebody and be thinking about, because it just constantly has us thinking about trauma. There's big T and little t trauma. Big T trauma is what happened last Monday in Boston. You want to work with me around that and the distress that caused me? Well, where were you? What were you doing? What time of day was it? Who were you with? I can pinpoint things like really, really to a finite point. Now let's talk about the guy who grew up in an alcoholic family, was constantly berated by his father, overweight, was weak and non-athletic while his father was a tough macho guy, and his father was an alcoholic. So what are we going to do? How are we going to pinpoint that? What day was it? Was Dad drunk or wasn't he drunk? Was he the happy drunk or the violent drunk? Was it before his father died or after? It's those sorts of things. It's the complexity of that. So that makes little t trauma so much harder to deal with. So much harder to be able to resolve because it's layered, because it has a kind of constancy. It becomes the person's experience of life, rather than just an experience that they had. And of course, in order to make peace with it, we minimize it, we forget it, we tell ourselves we deserved it. That's a huge thing for a lot of boys, is we grew up being abused and then being told that we deserved it because of our behavior, that's how you're disciplined, or those sorts of things. Complex PTSD, we're learning a lot about attachment and layered trauma. Just this idea that in the formative stages of 0 to 5, the degree to which we have healthy attachment, healthy mirroring from our loved ones, the degree to which we get that kind of connection can have a profound effect on the rest of our lives and our brain development. And then it can lead to other traumas as a result of our inability to form connection or form unhealthy relationships. And so the complexity of it develops. But what we're learning so much about this idea of attachment and pre-verbal trauma and how to be able to address that. And then iatrogenic trauma is literally the trauma that happens at the hand of the intervention that's supposed to help. So it's the trauma that we cause. And a lot of the time, it's the trauma that we cause because we haven't dealt with our trauma. So we act out of our trauma toward our clients, and either we don't see their trauma because we're in ours, or we don't see their trauma because we are in complete denial about what we have going on. So either we get triggered and then we create this kind of dynamic between kind of clashing trauma, or we're just in such denial about ours that we can't effectively support the client. Let's see, 420, 419. So the ACE study, how many of you are familiar with the ACE study? Kaiser Permanente did this study. It was a very important study in the sense that it was the first attempt to quantify this idea that said childhood maltreatment and family dysfunction could have a serious impact on our health in our later years. That was the idea. The way they got at it was by asking these, wow, this is a very sensitive mouse, by asking 10 questions. Before age 18, was there recurrent and severe emotional abuse, recurrent and severe physical abuse, contact sexual abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect? Thinking about your typical client, how many of you have clients who would endorse all 5 of those? 4? 3? So then you have the other 5 questions about growing up in a household with an alcoholic or drug user, a member being in prison, a mentally ill, chronically depressed, or institutionalized member, the mother being treated violently, both biological parents not being present. How many of your clients would endorse 3 to 5 of those? A lot? So let's just say 3 to 5 between the 10 questions total. We got 6 to 10, a score of 6 to 10. Well, what they found, because they had 17,000 participants and they matched their responses to these questions against their health records, what they found was that the magic number is 5. Anybody who endorses 5 or more of these experiences, much more likely to experience organic disease, social malfunction, and mental illness. Also trauma. So chronic disease, smoking, alcoholism, injection of legal drugs, obesity, hypertension, other chronic illnesses, involvement in the legal system, and development of post-traumatic stress disorder or other trauma. And the important thing about thinking about this is, I'm not going to ask you what your score is, but how many people working in the field do you think endorse 5 or more of those 10 questions? I would say a lot. I would say close to 80% of the people working in the field would have at least 5 of those. Because it's not like, when we feel this really strong pull and energy to help other people, it's not like there's not something there trying to get worked out. It's not just some altruism that means I just want to help other people. There's always something trying to work itself out. And so, what we have is we have a field that has regularly misunderstood, misdiagnosed, mistreated, or completely just missed trauma. And then we have those people come and they work in the field, and so they're working in their own undiagnosed, untreated trauma, and so what's the likelihood that we're going to be that effective dealing with trauma? And so that's one of the things that we stress. And we have no problem talking about the fact that, I wrote A Man's Way Through the 12 Steps, and then I wrote the Helping Men Recover, and I was the primary author of the Helping Men Recover. And from the period of starting that book to writing the curriculum, my involvement in therapy increased about 1,000% because of all the stuff that was being churned up. And since we've been doing the trainings, we've been continually engaged in our own counseling and kind of processing. And, my score is, depending on interpretation, a 6 or a 7. My partner's score is, depending on interpretation, a 0 or a 2. And so we come at it from different things, but the point is that the greatest impediment to providing effective services is us and our own stuff getting in the way. So what trauma-informed services are services that take the trauma into account. They avoid triggering trauma reactions. They adjust the behavior of counselors and other staff in the entire organization to support the individual's coping capacity. Allow survivors to manage their trauma symptoms successfully so that they are able to access, retain, and benefit from the services. So, trauma-informed services is extremely important. It's a completely different way of approaching services. And in a hospital-based partial hospital program, there are some really clear administrative policies, and there are rules. And one of the things, I'm gonna take a little risk here, and I'm gonna speak about a specific example that I just saw, where I was visiting another program in Kentucky, and should go unmentioned, but they happen to also have a partial hospital program. And we were doing the tour, and as we were doing the tour, what I saw was an African-American patient, an all-white staff. And the African-American patient was clearly escalated. And the way that the staff person, who was the primary person dealing with him, he did not look up at the individual. He did not say to the individual, "What's going on?" He just simply said, we don't use that language here. That's all he did. All he was worried about was the policy, was the rule. And so he didn't even look up and talk to the man or see the man, right? And so we were kind of standing there watching this happen. And what I was watching was the fact that the people who were giving me the tour weren't even paying attention to this. Because it's invisible to us. It's like, this guy, what's the likelihood that regardless of whether he was cursing or not, an African American would feel uncomfortable in an environment that's almost all white? That's the kind of trauma that we don't take into consideration. But what was more important was the guy was saying, "I'm distressed, I'm having a hard time here." And so the guy could say, the only thing the guy could say is, "We don't use that language here. I don't care what's going on." Okay, well, that's effective. So then he says, "Well, it's just how I am. It's just how I talk." He says, "Well, not in here you don't." Okay, well, that's effective. You just lost another opportunity to engage. So then he starts really cursing. And I'm thinking, you guys have to be seeing this. Am I the only one noticing this? And then the guy again he says one other thing and then he just ignores them. And I'm thinking okay, there you go. So what's going to happen with this guy? How's he going to do? And so that's what trauma-informed care does. I mean, in many ways it's just good patient care, but it's about saying, what is going on with you? I don't care about the rule. Fine, you're cursing. But what's going on? Let's talk about that. Let's see that first and foremost. And then we'll talk about the fact that, if you're going to be on this unit, let's talk about how we can help you in following the policies because they're important to us. So that's what trauma-informed care does. It shifts the way we view behavior. It shifts the way we interact with people. It shifts the environment that we create. The core principles of trauma-informed care are safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, empowerment. That's all good services, right? Except it's really hard to build a program, to build services, to build an environment where that is the constant focus. We do consulting with programs and we just do a simple exercise. Looking at these 5 principles, tell us how well you're doing with these, how well your program is doing with these. Now tell us the areas you're struggling with these and where your program is struggling with these. And you'd be amazed at what people talk about. That probably a lot of times administration has no idea about, that they're not paying attention to. But, you know, the challenge really is that one of the challenges is going to be opening this thing. All right. Well, I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to open it. But the thing is thinking about what does safety really look like? You know, we talk about safety, but what does it really look like? And what does it look like for men? Right? How many men come into our services and talk about not feeling safe? Not many is my guess. It's certainly our experience, is that men don't tend to walk in and say, you know, I don't really feel safe here. They don't come out explicitly and say that. Maybe as we engage them further down the road, they have a little more ability to do that. But my guess is it's still a very, very difficult thing, because a man saying I don't feel safe is tantamount to saying what? I'm weak, I'm powerless, I'm a punk, I don't know how to take care of myself, I'm a girl. You know, all of that sort of stuff is wrapped in psychologically. So we, from a trauma-informed perspective, take the assertion that says, or assumption as well, that says, you know what? Anytime a man comes into services for the first week at least, you should assume he doesn't feel safe. And all of your interpretations of his behavior, his engagement, what he does and doesn't do should be in the context of this man is trying to find some degree of safety here. So when he's acting like an asshole, my first thought is, not you're acting like an asshole, you need to get in line with the policies that we have here if you're going to stay at this program. It's going to be, okay, this man doesn't feel safe, how can I help him? If he's being disengaged, sarcastic, whatever, he's coming to group and he's being interruptive. But if he's brand new in group, you know, again, it's just kind of saying, what's he doing to make himself feel safe? And he's just, part of it, what he's doing is he's posturing. He's posturing to let the other guys know, you know what, I'm a badass. You don't want to mess with me because that's how I feel safe. Is it healthy? No. But is it something that you want to take him on for? No. Because all he's doing is doing exactly what he knows. And if you're thinking about those types of behaviors from the perspective of safety, it completely changes how you respond to them. It completely changes how you view what's happening. It's the same thing with trustworthiness. Trustworthiness and transparency are the kind of principles that go together. And it's really about us. It's about being clear. It's about doing what we say we're going to do. It's about taking responsibility when we need to take responsibility and clean something up. It's about saying, I don't expect you to follow this policy where I'm not going to. I don't expect you to act this way, but I'm not going to. And I've got an excuse because I've had a really hard day. I can be late to group because I was on a very important phone call. You can't be late to group because you're the client and you have a structured schedule. We're constantly sending messages that say, this isn't a trustworthy environment. But we're doing it out of laziness, and we're doing it out of the fact that it's the chaos that we thrive in. And why do we thrive in chaos? Because a lot of us grew up in chaos. It's what we know. It's how we thrive. It's how we get things done. Do I get things done by being serene, or do I get things done by being anxious and frenetic? Do I take on all of the kind of that addictive energy that's kind of all over the place, bouncing off the walls, or am I able to be a buffer from it and then kind of give something else. That's one of the biggest things about taking care of ourselves. Choice. Choice is a huge thing. Having a conversation, co-creating the treatment plan. Looking at the schedule and the schedule that you have. Almost every program I visit, they have their whole schedule written out on a piece of paper. And it's like, we know what they're going to do this day, this day, this day, this day. And to some degree, that is good. But from a trauma-informed standpoint, it's also kind of like, okay, but what does that mean? What does that schedule mean? And what are the services? And how much of this is because this is what you've done versus how much have you really stepped back and looked at what is the schedule that we need to give for the men in order to have the most effective thing, and not just so that it's the most convenient to the program or for the staff. And that's one of the things we've done. We just went into a program not too long ago, and they had just created their curriculum and their schedule, and we had a conversation with them about it. And they ultimately ended up making significant changes to their schedule because a lot of it was based on the fact that they had they were just constantly talking to the clients and the patients and not giving them anything other than cognitive-based exercises. Now, I know you guys have like 32 experiential therapists, and you guys have a great handle on the experiential part, the right brain kind of getting out of your head part, which is huge. So you, I'm sure, are ahead of the game when it comes to that, because that's a significant part. But what role does that play in the overall program? I don't know. How integrated is it into the process? What does lecture look like? How do men and women interact or not interact? It's those sorts of things of thinking about. And then consumer empowerment and skill building, empowerment literally being, what would you need in order to feel comfortable? What would treatment look like for you? Rather than saying, this is the schedule and this is the schedule you have to follow, what can we do to make this a more comfortable experience for you? And can we, and as we do that, can we move toward integrating you more into the daily schedule that everybody else has? Or something along those lines. But the reality is that we have these set schedules more for our convenience than for their benefit. So I'm sure I've probably stepped on some toes at this point. But, the reality is that trauma-informed care is hard. Because trauma-informed care doesn't care what the policy has been up until this point. It doesn't care what administration thinks, as just a reaction to doing these things. It's first and foremost, how do we integrate these principles into everything we do? So this is how you create a safe container: consistent structure, ritual repetition, and summaries and previews. And you're probably going to say, well, whoa. Didn't you just talk about how a daily schedule, is something that just seems lazy? Well, that's not what we're talking about. A consistent structure, meaning the ritual repetition, the summaries and previews. Like for us with the curriculum, we start every single group the exact same way, with a check-in, with meditation, with breathing, with a body scan or body check-in, with a resource installation for trauma, and then with reading from a meditation book. And so that structure lets them know we are starting group, and that is how we're going to start. Now, once that container's been established, then there's a whole different experience of what you're doing. But you're setting these really clearly defined bookends. We end every session the exact same as well. And then you do summaries and previews. This is what we're going to talk about today. This is what we talked about today, and this is what we're going to talk about at the next group. And these are the things that we're going to be discussing. And those little things can make a big difference. And of course, one of the most important things is it holds us accountable to following through on what we say we're going to do.
But that can be integrated in the schedule. Like, the structure can be integrated in the schedule, but the structure to help the client is more important than the schedule. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. So there's the structure of the schedule, and then there's the structure of the groups. And the structure of the schedule is different because the consistency, it's kind of like this. I'm talking about what you're doing to create a space where they're going to be doing kind of the intensive work. That's the container. Now, there's the larger container of the program, but that's really where the principles of trauma-informed care come in that really say, we value your experience and we really want you to feel safe here. So hopefully that doesn't sound, hopefully that distinction makes sense and it doesn't sound contradictory. So trauma lives in the body while the memory is trapped in the mind. You guys do the experiential stuff. You guys do the other things, the courses and everything. That's a huge piece. But the only thing is that a lot of the times we're doing those things and we're getting men active. We're having them do some of these things that trigger the trauma, but then we don't know what to do. We don't know how to respond. And the reality is that we trigger men's trauma, and for a lot of men, they don't respond right away. It takes men a while to process or a while for it to hit them. It'll hit them a day later or 2 days later, maybe even a week later. The stuff that we dug up when we had them, draw a picture of the first step. And, we're not necessarily paying attention to those things. So being, again, trauma-informed assumes that when I take a man on a ropes course and I'm having him at 30 feet high or 25 feet high, it's not just helping him work through the fear in that moment. It's about helping to understand in the context of what all this means and anything else, in the context of the man rules, what does it mean for a man to go through that experience? So again, it's like this constant lens of what is a man's experience and what is a man likely to be experiencing as a result of some of those exercises, and how can we just help him process it more from the perspective of his being a man. This is not always the most popular, but a place that has 32 experiential therapists probably gets this. And that is that when it comes to dealing effectively with trauma, CBT is not the answer. CBT is not the answer because cognitive behavioral therapy is inherently limited when it comes to being able to help trauma, because the prefrontal cortex is not available when a man is being triggered. When a man goes back into his trauma or when he's being significantly triggered or emotionally flooded, the prefrontal cortex is not available. You can talk to me about all the refusal skills you want. We can have all kinds of little things that you want me to do and that I can tell you I'm going to do, but then when I get in that situation back at home and I am in a experience with my spouse and it just brings up this whole past thing, I can't just engage in the cognitive skills that we talked about. So what we have to do is, with CBT, if you're going to use CBT, then with CBT we have to use trauma-focused interventions. We have to help men learn how to be in their body. We have to help men learn how to breathe. We have to help men learn how to do some of these resource installation strategies that can really help them begin to see. It's kind of like you can watch those videos, right? Those videos where if you're watching it in regular time, it looks like you just saw a blur across the screen. But if you slow the video down, you'll see that it was a guy on a horse with a light riding across the screen because you've slowed it down enough. That's what it is for trauma. Trauma is a highly, highly intense reactive experience in the brain, in the body, that has the person feeling out of control. And so what we want to do is we want to help release some of the trauma from the body. We want to help rewire the brain through things like EMDR. Are you familiar with EMDR? Do you have anybody here doing EMDR with the clients? Boy, I can't recommend that enough. If you were to do one thing to deal effectively with trauma, it would be to get therapists on site who are really trained in trauma and can do EMDR, biofeedback, neurofeedback, and I saw that you guys already do the yoga and stuff. And so there's trauma-focused yoga, and then there's yoga. And so, those are some of the distinctions. But EMDR is incredibly powerful because it helps to do that rewiring of the brain that we're talking about. We can see now from PET scans and CAT scans we can literally watch the prefrontal cortex go offline. We can watch all the things firing and all the activity in the prefrontal cortex, and then the person being triggered and going back into a traumatic event, and the thing just turns dark. So, we're learning a lot about the brain. And then, of course, there's so many men who have traumatic brain injury. We don't often catch it, and with that, there could be significant cognitive impairment. So is there another way to view men's trauma? Well, kind of like I said earlier, as funny as this is, if you want one word that's probably going to describe a lot of men exhibiting the symptoms of trauma, this is it. And if you work, some of us are like, oh yeah, I love working with assholes. I love working with men who act like assholes. And, that may be true, but the question is, but are you still able to see them? And what I mean by that is, like, it can be a bit of a game. Like, I do. I personally love working with the guys who are much more in my face than the passive, aggressive guys who I just want to punch in the face. So I know, for me, that if I've got a guy who's really passive aggressive, the best thing I can do is get him off my caseload. The best thing I can do is do a therapeutic, transfer to somebody else, because that is somebody who I just do not work effectively with. Now, the whole thing about this, though, is that, again, if we begin to think of men's trauma, then anytime we have a guy acting out, anytime we have a guy acting like an asshole, instead of thinking, what's wrong with you, thinking, what's going on with you? What's happening with you? So it should be obvious that, I believe that, one, trauma is pervasive in men's lives, and that there are differences in the way men experience, respond to, exhibit the symptoms of trauma, and heal from trauma. And, again, some people might say, well, damn, but, okay, so maybe that's somebody who's a hyper-masculine guy, but what about somebody who doesn't endorse all these rules? Are they going to have a similar experience? And I would say yes. And the reason I would say yes is because, again, we're still judging ourselves against the rules. Like, I never thought of myself, part of my recovery has been learning how to embrace some of these rules. I had a violent alcoholic father. I was medically induced to hit puberty. I was a mess. I was a mess, and I had no sense of being a man. None. So for me, my recovery has been about beginning to embrace some of these things that are actually congruent with who I am. Like, I am competitive. I love being competitive. I am loud, if you haven't figured it out. There are things on here that fit for me, and then there are some things that don't. But nonetheless, even though I rejected a lot of these rules, in some ways I almost judged myself more harshly than others, because it was still in the context of, but you're not a man. But what I've come to realize in doing this work is I have yet to meet a man who is really grounded and confident in feeling like he's a man. That inside of almost every man is a question of, like, am I man enough? Am I a man? Do I make sense as a man, kind of thing? So that's how trauma is different. Male abuse victims tend to identify with the abuser as a means of reclaiming personal power and attempting to secure safety. Again, from the perspective of the rules, if the rules are constantly telling men that power is important, that it's important not to be weak, that it's important to be strong, it's important to stand up for yourself, well, at some point, a lot of men who are abuse victims are going to take that on, but in the space of the trauma, they can't regulate it. It becomes distorted, and we'll talk about that. So thinking about this schematic again, what's important about this from a gendered perspective is if you look at these bottom three, retreat, self-destructive action, and destructive action. I know this is probably hard to read the the words, so if you have it in front of you, hopefully it's a little easier to read the words. But in general, if you had to place women somewhere along these three, where would you put them? Retreat, and anywhere else? Self-destructive action. So we'd put women in retreat and self-destructive action. Now, of course, not all women retreat. There's been some extremely aggressive, externalized women who, don't fit into that. But a lot of women, and the rules for being a woman definitely kind of push women towards that. So then where would men fall? Destructive action, and some destructive action. And, I love that you all have beds for men in your eating disorder clinic. What a freaking novel concept that men actually have eating disorders. They obviously don't show up the exact same way they do for women, but eating disorders have been a major part of men's experience for as long as they have been for women. Body image is a huge issue for men. Absolutely huge. And so these self-destructive pieces are important for men too. What we have done a lot with men's services and men's experiences is because men don't talk about certain things, we have in many ways decided those aren't issues for men. Rather than taking this whole menu of issues and then saying, how might this apply to men? So body image is finally something that's coming out as something that's a huge issue for men. But we used to think only women felt self-conscious about their bodies, and we put a lot of attention on that, but almost gave no attention to it for men. Or the same thing about eating disorders or self-harm or, many other things. Just the whole idea of relationships. It's not cool for guys to admit that they care about their relationships. It's getting better because there's a shift. There's really been a cultural shift in how men and women share themselves and their personal lives and their inner lives in relationship and in general. And so that shift has made it, a little easier for men to begin to engage in relationships and being fathers. So while that is very positive in a lot of ways, it's also created a lot of confusion. A lot of confusion for a lot of men. And so what we'll often have people say is, well, don't you think for the people who are working with the younger guys who are coming in, these rules don't apply as much? And our response is, well, first off, we've had a lot of young guys go through our curriculum and that we've worked with, and that hasn't been the experience. Because while the rules are not as strong for them, one, they still exist, and two, now there's just confusion. When is it okay for me to cry? When is it okay for me to share my feelings? When is it going to be something that somebody actually honors and respects versus getting me punched in the face, made fun of, or, even told, man up or whatever? And the other thing that it's important to say is that let's not confuse ourselves that that's only men saying that. Women have bought into the rules, and women, nothing is scarier for a woman than to actually find the kind of guy that a lot of women say they want, which is a guy who shares his feelings and who does a lot of the things that are antithetical to the rules. Because then a woman has to confront how much she's interjected the rules. It's like, okay, well, I wanted a guy to open up, but seriously, relax. Okay, I wanted you to share your feelings, but we don't have to cry at American Idol every time. I mean, it's like, so it's like that, it's that challenge of creating a space for men to be open and vulnerable and share who they are, while helping them to know when that's safe. And to realize that it can be just as unsafe around women as it can be around men. So the important thing about this, noticing the time, is that what we know about borderline personality disorder is that it's very, very similar. The features of it are very similar to that of complex PTSD. And so they've been challenging the diagnosis. When you think about men, you think about how men tend to externalize the effects of trauma, what would you say is the analog? What diagnosis would most likely limit mimic the symptoms of complex PTSD for men.
Antisocial personality disorder.
Yeah, that guy.
There it is.
Right? So antisocial personality disorder, well, what does that mean? Well, what that means is, think about the labels. Think about what it means when you say a woman, or a man, but women primarily, has borderline. First off, we don't even say she has borderline. She is borderline. It's who she is. It's her entity. And when I notice that in a file, how quickly have I already made my prognosis? How have I already created the therapeutic relationship? How am I already practically trying to get her off my caseload? Well, it's the same thing with antisocial or narcissistic personality. But if there's a high correlation with complex PTSD, then, what would it look like if the exact same woman, the exact same file comes before us, but what we see instead of borderline is complex PTSD? Are we going to view it differently? Are we going to have a different attitude toward her prognosis? Working with her? Are we going to interpret her behaviors differently? That's what it means to be trauma-informed. That's one of the shifts that we begin to talk about. So I've talked about this, about compassion and accountability. I'm gonna describe this exercise rather than go through it, just simply, again, because of time. I'm not going to hold you captive past 5 o'clock. I'd like to go a little bit past 5, but I know this is the end of the day for you, and I've got to catch a plane. But what we've done with this interactive lecture, I alluded to this earlier, but in the curriculum that we have and in the work that we do, we know there are topics that men have to talk about. And we know there are topics that men don't want to talk about, or that are very hard for men to talk about, or that we haven't always created the safest therapeutic milieu for them to talk about. And certainly abuse is one of them. So what we've come up with, homophobia and misogyny is another one. And we use the interactive lecture in the curriculum to get men to talk about homophobia and misogyny without even realizing they're doing it. But what the interactive lecture does is that instead of talking at the men or trying to do something else, we have the men teach the material. We list all 4 of these different forms of abuse, and then we say, okay, what's an example of physical abuse? They give us all the examples of physical abuse, then all the examples of verbal, emotional, and sexual. And we want to make sure that there are certain ones that get up there, but we just have a conversation with them about this. Then we ask a question and we say, how many of you know somebody who was physically abused? All of them, right? At least a lot of them. And then we'll say, well, what do you think that was like for that person? So what are we doing?
Kind of sidestepping it a little bit. They're still talking about themselves in a way. I mean, somebody's hearing the message that the other guy might be sending and maybe relating to it.
Exactly. So what we call it is moving from surface to depth, and we're building empathy. It's the therapeutic process of building empathy. The first thing that they're doing is, one, they're even teaching each other what abuse is. Wait a second, my parents were yelling all the time. I understand that calling somebody, an expletive is abuse, but just yelling? I'm an emotional person. How can that be considered abuse? So then they have a conversation about it. And we don't seek to resolve any of it. We just have a conversation. Somebody says, I don't think that's abuse. Then we say, well, what do you all think? So they have a conversation. Then we say, so how many of you know somebody? So then what's the next question? How many of you were ever? How many of you have ever been physically abused, verbally, emotionally, sexually? And we go through each one. What was that like for you? And by this time, the guys are amazing at opening up and sharing what's going on with them. So then what's the last question we ask? How many of you have ever done this? And what do you think that was like for that person? And by that time, we've already built in enough of a process of building empathy that they can go there. And they can go there in powerful ways. And then you get to say, and so now what's it like for you as you reflect on that? And so it's this really powerful process of that. And we have other interactive lectures in the curriculum where we talk about that. So trauma-informed care is really a shift of moving from what is wrong to what happened to you. What is going on with you? So we rarely acknowledge that the therapeutic process may be incompatible with how men are raised. So I talked about that, the idea of socialization. We spend not nearly enough time talking to men and focusing on men's relationships as we need to. If relationships, I mean, what we're learning about the brain now is that the human beings, men and women, are wired for relationship. Our brain grows and develops through relationship. We are wired for connection. The rules are anti-connection. That creates an incredible conflict with men. And so why do we spend so little time really helping men navigate relationships? And what does that mean? Well, this is male relational dread that I was talking about earlier. Think about how things would change, how we could get men to really engage in their relationships if we really started talking to men and meeting them where they're at when it comes to relationships. And what I mean by that is, if you think of the characteristics of a healthy relationship, kind of relationship that, we suggest that people move toward, right? Are these fair characteristics? Intimacy, honesty, vulnerability, compromise, trust, sharing emotions? Would you say that's a pretty good description of a healthy relationship? How many of those are part of the rules? None. So we spend all our time training men not to do this, telling them to devalue it, and not only that, but for so many men, at the heart of their touching intimacy and vulnerability and trust and sharing their feelings is their trauma. Because how do we treat little boys who share their emotions? What do we do to them? How do we treat little boys who are vulnerable and not tough, quote unquote? Get tough, toughen up.
Yeah.
Right? Intimacy, how we treat little boys who are being intimate. So at the heart of a lot of this for men is we're inviting them into their trauma. I mean, this has the potential to shift the whole way we think about intimate partner violence. If at the heart of men's deep desire to connect is this horrible experience around disconnection, but we don't talk to them about it. We might talk to them about these experiences and tell them to do this, but we don't tell them that this could be the toughest work you ever do. That connecting authentically with another human being could be the scariest part. That everything we're doing with you here is all just practice for the real work of building a healthy relationship. And it will be hard, and it will take everything you have to be able to do this. And men with trauma suffer greatly because, this was my experience, I was constantly wanting intimacy and vulnerability with the women that I would date and I would see, and so I was constantly moving into it. And every time I moved into it, something in me got triggered that I had no fucking clue about. Pardon me. But it's true. I had no clue, and I was acting in a way where I really felt like I was crazy. And the amazing thing is that once I started talking about it in meetings, there's a whole conspiracy of silence around that in the men's recovery community. And instead what we do is we talk to each other about what a bitch she is. What we do is we talk about the fact that, you know what, I got a little angry at my spouse. I got a little angry at my girlfriend. But again, it's men doing what they know. Men doing what we've been taught to do, and without any preparation for being able to deal with the intensity of what those relationships are asking us to do. We talk about intimacy. Oh, there's so much more for me to talk about. Like I said, I was going to go 10 minutes later, but it's 5 o'clock. I mean, are you all able to stay? Are you interested in staying? I'll stay, but if you have to go, and it's better to just end, that's fine. It's a struggle for me to fit everything Mike wanted me to fit into a 2-hour thing. And that's okay. You've got the You've got the handout. I'll stick around for questions, or I can just kind of quickly go through the rest and just talk a little bit about this. So, group conscience, what do you want to do? Go for it? All right, I'll go for it, and then, so the main thing is we'll skip the videos. So sexuality is a huge piece of the treatment process and the treatment milieu and men's experience. There's probably no relapse that a man has that is in some level connected to sex. You think about eating disorders and you think about sexual image, sexual experience. You think about body image and the experience of feeling themselves as a sexual being. So many aspects of sexuality, yet how well do we address men's sexuality? A lot of it comes from our own discomfort. I was in Kentucky just last week doing a training, and we do a 3-day training where people learn to implement the curriculum, and part of it is they get assigned specific exercises to practice and then facilitate, because we create like a quasi-group experience. And these 2 women came to me and they said, we can't do this exercise. And I'm like, well, what's the exercise? I'm like, well, we're talking to them about sex. And I'm like, okay. But, you know, I really tried not to be shaming about it with them. And I just said, okay, so just notice that. Notice how scary it is for you of the prospect of having a really honest, open conversation with the men about sex. And what does that say? If you who've been in the field for 15 years find it that difficult and scary and confusing, what the hell do you think it's like for them? And don't we owe it to them to address that if we're going to put them out in the world where men define so much of their relationships through sex? That as they step into that crucible of male relational dread, one of the things that they will often seek to take care of them is something connected to their sexuality, some kind of sexual acting out. And a lot of times because we don't have any appreciation for the complexity of male sexuality. So we talk about that. We talk about spirituality. The curriculum itself, there's 4 modules: self, relationship, sexuality, and spirituality. That's what it looks like right there. Helping Men Recover. 18 sessions, ideally done twice a week. It's a very meticulously written, put together facilitator guide. It's a very manualized thing, even though we do a lot of kinesthetic stuff and experiential stuff, or kind of more right brain creative stuff. It's still very manualized. And we have a man's workbook. And the little things about being gender responsive is that for helping women recover, it's called a woman's journal. We call it a man's workbook. It's those little things that can make a difference to the guy who we're going to lose because he doesn't want to do that girly art. You know, and it's those things that we took into consideration for every single thing we did. Is it evidence-based? That's obviously a huge thing with a lot of funders, with a lot of programs. Is it evidence-based? According to the APA, Helping Men Recover is evidence-based because it's only been out for 2 years. We're just now starting the research on it. But what the APA says is it the best thing available that combines the most known research, most effective practices for that specific population? And so from that perspective, it would be, but we've seen incredible differences in completion rates. For us, over a 2-year period, completion rates went from 70 to 87%, and this was in outpatient. We saw a 300% increase in referrals from mental health services. In other words, follow-through for men following through for referrals for mental health services, and self-referring, seeking out, saying, I need additional services. I mean, it's really phenomenal. More, and just as importantly, is that we've seen a significant difference in men who go through the curriculum identifying symptoms of trauma after going through the curriculum. So they'll come in, like with the comparison group, they come in and they're probably identifying about the same occurrence of trauma. But afterwards, the group that went through the curriculum and went through these services has a much higher degree of acknowledging trauma than the other. There's a lot of stuff around design and implementation. I didn't really see that necessarily being the focus of this conversation today. Again, because it's a briefer thing. It's an overview of the model, of the philosophy, of the theory, and a little bit about the services that we provide. So there's a lot that can be said about this. If you have specific questions about any of that, we can, I'll stick around to answer those. But that's pretty much it. Whoa, that was abrupt. Oh boy. Okay. This is the most sensitive mouse I've ever experienced. Now watch, it's going to do it again. All right, that's fantastic. All I'm trying to do is put up my contact information, which you have. So that's pretty much it. Thanks for letting me go over, and I appreciate your attention. And if you have any questions or comments or reactions, it's a lot packed in. It can be pretty intense. And I saw a lot of head shaking as well, so I'm guessing that it aligns with a lot of what you've been thinking or maybe even struggling with. Thoughts, comments, reactions?
The books and workbooks, that's available online?
Yeah, through my website, you can just contact me. Mike I'm pretty sure Mike's got a copy of A Man's Way, and I think Ron, isn't there a counselor named Ron at Harrington?
Harrington, sure, the family counselor.
Yeah, so he's been trained in developing the curriculum. He's got a copy of A Man's Way. He uses it. So he would be a good contact for you around checking out the resource and just hearing about how they've been doing
We have
it.
programs where hospitals or treatment centers apply, integrate this into their programming.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot. I mean, that's what we get trained, that's what we get hired to do. I mean, I also do these kind of informational presentations. And I'll say this. We have yet to do anything with eating disorders.
Well, right, because I'm just thinking, and we've been talking about this, that the men are different than the women, and we treated them all the same.
Right.
Which is really not all that helpful, because men are different. And
We're doing to men with eating disorders and even with trauma what we did to women with the original services, and that is, once again, putting them in the same bucket.
So, I mean, of course, there's layers and layers of administration that would have to be gone through to implement this. But.
Well, it doesn't hurt that I had a fantastic conversation with Dr. Polovin and with Mike, who's, yeah. I didn't get to meet the big. Is this still being taped?
Oh, shoot, I just said layers.
Well, you know what? It's true. And in a trauma-informed system, you'd be able to say that without any concern. Because